nervous tissue comprising it. Because we became slightly familiar already with the adrenal medulla, we'll very briefly review it today, but we're going to focus our attention on the adrenal cortex, which has 3 layers, and let's see what you retained over the last few hours. The zona glomerulosa releases what? What are they called? Mineralocorticoids. Very good. Okay. The zona fasciculata releases glucocorticoids. Very good. And the zona reticularis releases Gonadocorticoids. Okay. And there's a whole bunch of different types of hormones which would come from each layer that would categorically be a mineralocorticoid or a glucocorticoid or a gonadocorticoid. We're just going to pick one of the most famous kind from each of those layers and just elaborate on that one. Okay, so we're just kind of being really specific. Okay. To illustrate for you the complexity for hormonal pathway manufacturing, our steroid hormones, if you remember way back in the Unit 1 material, we learned that our steroid hormones, the suffix of these O-N-E type of hormones, come from a molecule called cholesterol. Do you remember that? We said the smooth ER helps manufacture this. And so each of these cell types have the ability to utilize cholesterol and then manufacture it differently. And so within these cell types, they have obviously different types of enzymes that make the specific type of output hormone, right, that it's manufacturing. Does that make sense? They're specialized. And so, for example, if we look at the production of mineralocorticoids, cholesterol can be converted into a couple of precursors of this one. The second one listed should look really familiar. Where do we see that? Do y'all remember? During what? Pregnancy. Okay, we talked about it a little bit in its relationship with LH, how it initiates the production of a hormone called progesterone. Well, in this pathway, progesterone is actually just an intermediate ending up to the production of these things called, these molecules called aldosterone. And that's the hormone that we'll study out of this first layer, the zona glomerulosa. As well, if you notice from your handout number 4, hot 4, you notice the aldosterone targets the kidney. So that means we're going to see it again at the end of the next couple of weeks. As well, cholesterol doesn't always have to make aldosterone. It can make other hormones that you may be familiar with, like cortisol. You've heard of that maybe? Okay. And it can also serve as a precursor for things called androgens, which are kind of like considered to be masculizing steroid hormones. Okay. So they all have the same precursor. Which molecule? Cholesterol. Okay, very good. So if we're going to look at the mineralocorticoids, before I actually get into the specific pathway, remember this is the adrenal cortex, and it's always going to have a hypothalamic pituitary stimulus. The hypothalamus will always release, not T, I want to release something from the adrenal cortex. From the hypothalamus. If I want to stimulate the adrenal cortex, the hypothalamus has to release. That comes from the, she said ACTH, that comes from the pituitary. CRH. Why wasn't it TRH? TRH is thyrotropin, and eventually it's going to trigger the thyroid. We're not in the thyroid anymore. We're down in the adrenal gland in the kidneys. And so if we need the hypothalamus to activate eventually a pathway for the adrenal gland, it has to release what? CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, goes in the portal system, targets the anterior pituitary to release. ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, which goes in the blood to activate each of the 3 layers of the adrenal gland. So where I'm going is we're going to see that hypothalamus anterior pituitary relationship 1, 2, 3 times because there's 3 layers. However, each of the 3 layers are not strictly regulated tropically. They're going to have other humoral stimuli on them. Okay, so we'll see multiple types of stimulus for the adrenal cortex. Does that make sense? It's not just the tropic pathway that we'll see. And so a good example is the release of these mineralocorticoids. The mineralocorticoid that we're going to hone in on is called aldosterone. Aldosterone is the mineralocorticoid that we're going to study. And if you remember from your handout, it has something to do with sodium reabsorption at the kidney. So therefore, aldosterone would target the kidney to reabsorb sodium. And it also promotes, and so reduces sodium excretion. Maybe a better way to say it is reabsorbs sodium. It promotes, yes, it reduces sodium excretion, but I want you to put just slash. The way it reduces it is by reabsorption. So we're adding is, yes, it reduces sodium excretion, right? We're just saying because it promotes reabsorption at the kidneys. We're just retaining reabsorbing sodium. As well as it causes the release of potassium. So we're keeping sodium and getting rid of potassium under the influence of this hormone called aldosterone. Repeated right there, sorry. It's already on there. Sorry about that. Kind of out of order. So it directly targets the kidneys to retain sodium and release potassium. But the catch is, if sodium is retained, the way that the kidney tubules we'll see coming up are built is that it creates an osmotic gradient, so water will flow passively as well. So it creates an osmotic gradient. Sodium is kept and water is kept. And so what's happening here? I keep sodium and I keep water. Where's it being kept to? Where's it being sent back to, do you think? Where's it being kept? The kidney keeps it and then sends it to where? If the kidney keeps something, it doesn't push it out as urine, where does it go? To where? It may be, but before it can get stored, it has to get sent to your bloodstream. Okay? And so basically, it's just a way to keep your sodium and water content up in the blood. Little difficult to store water and sodium, but they could certainly go intracellular. You're right, though. But it doesn't stay necessarily in the kidney. And so if we look at the mineralocorticoid aldosterone, that familiar ACTH pathway can trigger the release of aldosterone, right? So it can be tropically regulated by ACTH from the from the anterior pituitary, as well as it's probably a little bit more sensitive just to existing blood concentrations of sodium and potassium. So if I said blood, what type of control is that? Humoral. Okay, so it can be humorally regulated in response to what type of sodium levels do you think would cause aldosterone to be released? Blood sodium levels that are low, or potassium levels that are high can trigger this pathway. Another pathway called the renin-angiotensin mechanism, I'm going to mention it now. I'm going to mention it in the cardiovascular system, but I'm really not going to fully explain it until we get into the renal system. So probably not till the very last day of class discussion will I fully address the renin-angiotensin mechanism. But basically it's a cascade activated by the kidneys. Okay? And so technically I guess you could call this a tropic, it's kind of a humoral tropic shades of gray kind of pathway. So we'll come back to that. But if renin is present, we can activate this pathway. So these first three things, if my blood sodium is low, or my blood potassium is high, or if ACTH is high, or the renin-angiotensin mechanism is activated, each of these three things turn on the pathway. We can actually inhibit the release of aldosterone by a product called atrial natriuretic peptide, or you can abbreviate it ANP. That might conjure up something. What word on there looks maybe familiar to you? Atrium, from the heart. Did you know the heart is an endocrine gland? we call it a secondary endocrine gland. It actually releases a hormone that inhibits the release of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. So this one inhibits the pathway. So on your handout, I just have this part right here, but if I were to complete this, hypothalamus, if I were looking at point 1, hypothalamus releases CRH, very good, targets the anterior pituitary to release ACTH, and activates the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone and the other mineralocorticoids, which has an effect with the kidney to do what? Store or release which? Retain what? Water. Keeping, and specifically it is sodium, and indirectly it's going to be water, but you're correct. And it's going to release what? Potassium is going to be eliminated. This pathway is summarized for you in the image. I tried to squeeze it in there. This chapter was getting a little bit long, so you got to rotate it in there. So it's just, instead of having to take up an entire pathway, each of those 4 pathways are summarized in the image on the bottom of page 10. And you can see the stimulatory pathways are illustrated by the lines that are straight, and one inhibitory pathway for the release of aldosterone is in the dashed line. Okay, so what we learned is that typical ACTH pathway, CRH, ACTH, triggers the release of aldosterone. Secondarily, we talked about our changing sodium or potassium levels humorally can activate the release of aldosterone. In addition, we can see this renin pathway, which we'll fully cover in chapter 18, 19, I think is where that is. And the kidneys can actually stimulate this pathway. And conversely, we can also see AMP is an inhibitory or an antagonist to the release of aldosterone. And it comes from the heart. When our blood pressure gets a little bit too high and the heart's stretching too much, heart says stop retaining water, stop retaining sodium, to bring our blood volume back down to set point. Okay? So that is aldosterone. What questions at this point do you have about aldosterone controls or kind of its primary jobs? Okay. So that is from the first of 3 layers of the adrenal cortex. We'll talk about the next layer for the production of glucocorticoids. And the primary glucocorticoid that we'll study is called cortisol. And of the hormones, you probably are familiar, at least heard of this one, cortisol or cortisone type of hormones. And what it does is help you with stress and to remind you we're in the endocrine system, so we're looking at long-term stress, so more than someone slamming a door and startling you. Okay, so I don't know, you're worried about completing homework 5 by Sunday because you're going to be skiing in the Alps of wherever, right? So you're going to worry about that. You're going to release your cortisol. Okay? And what it does is keep our blood nutrients, okay, like our sugar, our blood volume, and our fatty acids, and our amino acids. It brings them, it keeps them constant, but maybe a note that you can add is it brings them above normal set point. Okay? So it elevates them more than if you are rest and digest. And so it keeps them constant, but maybe you could say high. Higher than if you were under the control of the parasympathetic nervous system. Does that make sense? So if I'm stressed out over a long period of time, my body's releasing sugar, my body's breaking down fats, and it's breaking down proteins to keep that stressful response powered. Okay? It also promotes a process called gluconeogenesis, which we did not fully address, but we did walk through the terminology and you guys were pretty comfortable with. An alternative way to make more glucose and sugars. So it keeps our blood volume up, keeps our blood pressure up, keeps our sugars, our fats, and our amino acids elevated above typical kind of set points. Okay. It is also going to be regulated by our familiar hypothalamic anterior pituitary axis, if you will, but it's also responsive to existing stressors in the body. I think we mentioned that hypothalamus can certainly trigger this pathway. And the box that I have down there is just reiterating, again, the source of nutrients, not just sugars, but amino acids and fatty acids are liberated in the blood above typical kind of set point to power your body through stressful events. So at face value, cortisol looks like a good mechanism for what? Does anybody want to take anything for? Everybody wants to do what? In America, everybody wants to lose weight. No matter how skinny you are, everybody wants to lose weight, right? Okay? And so at face value, cortisol looks like a good weight loss mechanism because it's taking stored fats and breaking them down. It's taking stored sugars and releasing them, right? And we'll come back and make full circle and see why that's not a good idea to be stressed out all the time for the sake of weight loss. Okay. All right. The third layer we're going to just briefly walk over or discuss. The third layer releases these things called androgens, and a primary one released from there is testosterone. And so this is a fine example as how something you might consider to be more masculinizing actually found in females as well. So we have both masculine and feminine type hormones of both genders. And so this is a source of our masculinizing, right, and androgynous type of hormones. Okay. And so we can see this working with onset of puberty, appearance of what's considered to be secondary sex characteristics. So if you think about development of mammary tissue, deepening of the boys, skeletal muscle development, bone growth, all those types of things are associated with this. Bless you. So in an adult, it'd be more like tissue maintenance, just kind of keeping metabolism kind of going in the tissues. Okay. So that's actually the 3 layers of the adrenal cortex. We talked about mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and very briefly about our gonadocorticoids. The aldosterone and the cortisol, well, definitely the aldosterone we'll see again in the renal system. And so, same pathway, right, our CRH-ACTH pathway. What questions do you have at this point about the adrenal cortex and the 3 classes of corticosteroids which it releases? All right. Y'all looking pretty excited about this stuff today. Don't contain it too much. Keep it in. All right. We're going to review the adrenal medulla. Sometimes you may hear it called the medulla, tomato, whatever, the middle of the adrenal gland. And if you recall from, I think it was chapter 11, is where we learned and called the adrenal medulla like a modified postganglion nerve cell. And so these cells respond to acetylcholine, they have the nicotinic receptors, and they also have the capacity to release which neurohormones? Which neurohormones are released from the medulla? Figurative crickets are going crazy right now. The adrenal medulla does provide a source of sympathetic neurotransmitter into the blood. Okay, so it does release epinephrine and norepinephrine into the circulatory system. And technically you can call those neurohormones. And they allow us to deal with stress, but what kind of stress? Short-term stress, very good. Okay, so quick onset when you get startled, whatever. put on the spot by the teacher in class, right? Adrenal medulla is going to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. Thank you for playing along today. All right, so if you recall, we talked about the adrenal medulla. It does release epinephrine and norepinephrine in response to short-term stress, but as well, the cortex helps us deal with more prolonged stress, and so it maintains that sympathetic effect. And so this image in your handout on page number 12 summarizes this. So we're going to look at stress. We're going to both look at short-term and long-term. Just to recap for you, the adrenal medulla is innervated by the sympathetic nervous system. So we have a preganglion and a postganglion, right, type of stimulus to it. And which part of our body helps us deal with stress? What part of our brain? Where have we been kind of focusing on the last couple of... The what? Hypothalamus. Okay, very good. In our short-term response, the hypothalamus is activated. It can activate our spinal nerves, which will stimulate the adrenal medulla. And if we recall, the adrenal medulla, you'll know for now and ever, it releases epinephrine and norepinephrine when we have a quick, startling, perceived or real stressful event. And this box down here summarizes the sympathetic effect. Heart rate goes up, respiratory rate goes up, sugar's released, etc., etc. Blood pressure, blood is shunted towards skeletal muscles and away from the digestive system, whatever, right? And so we're getting ready to power through a real or perceived fight or flight type of mechanism. However, if the stressful event prolongs, let's say it's a mental perceived stress about an exam coming up, or you think you forgot something or whatever, or let's say you're physically hurt and you had an injury a year ago and your back is out of alignment and you just have pain every day, okay? The adrenal gland will also be activated, and it's going to be activated also through the hypothalamus, but this time more hormonally controlled through the release of that CRH, what? CRH then? ACTH, okay? Will go and activate the cortex of the adrenal gland. Two of the three hormone classes from the adrenal gland help us prolong or deal with this stressful event. The first we talked about are mineralocorticoids like aldosterone. The way it helps us deal with stress is keeping our blood volume up, which actually brings our blood pressure up. Okay, so it's mimicking, it's prolonging that elevated blood pressure by bringing your blood volume up. And the way it does that is retaining sodium and retaining water. So the mineralocorticoids just bring your blood volume, blood pressure up. And again, if you have a prolonged stress, it might bring it up above your normal set point range. The other type, I need high blood pressure. What else do I need? If I've got a stressful event, I also need my blood sugar, and the rest of my nutrients need to go which way? Up. So which class of corticosteroids can help deal with this? Glucocorticoids like cortisol. So it brings our blood sugar up, it catabolizes proteins, it catabolizes fats, so they can be in the blood and be utilized to power the body for healing or physical activity or whatever the case may be. Here's the downside though. If you have the prolonged glucocorticoid secretion, maybe you're fat, maybe you do lose a little weight, right? What's going to happen? Third point. Your immune system's going to plummet, right? And what happens? You get sick. Okay, very good. You've probably actually experienced this. I see it the most like during the fall semester, okay, when finals hit, and you're stressed, and you power through, and you make the test, and as soon as you get the week off, right? During that week, you don't get to enjoy it because you're sick, right? And has ever happened to you? Okay. You probably had this big glucocorticoid surge, and then your body's just kind of recuperating. Okay. And so the summary is that the adrenal gland, both layers, allow us to deal with stress, whether it be short-term sympathetic or more prolonged, right, stress dealing with the adrenal cortex. What questions you have over the relationship between the cortex and the medulla of the adrenal gland, or maybe about is the pancreas. It technically has both endocrine and exocrine function. If you remember, exocrine glands release products via a duct to the surface. And so the exocrine function is for digestion. And so therefore, we're not going to address it. We're going to look at the endocrine function of the pancreas. But the cinar cells of the pancreas, when you go to nutrition, you'll study the products which aid in digestion. We're going to look at the pancreatic islets of the pancreas. They're called the islets of Langerhans, which is an alternative name. And it produces 3 types of hormones, which makes it endocrine, or the endocrine gland. If you were to visually look at a light microscope image of the pancreas, the dark staining areas are the enzyme-producing cells that are for digestion that will be excreted into the digestive system. In the lighter staining area are the hormonal-producing cells. And you can see how they came up with the term islets, right? It almost looks like a little island, okay? And it's those cells which make 3 different types of hormones. From your little worksheet, we actually just focused on 2, and that's the 2 that we're going to focus on in class. The pancreas is appropriately located adjacent to the digestive system, to the stomach, because it facilitates digestion and metabolism. So the pancreas is this thing right here. So 3 primary cell types that you'll find in the islets. We have alpha cells, beta cells, and delta cells. Be sure to use the suffix that they're cells, because you know the alpha, beta, delta, whatever, are just Greek letters for A, B, D. Right? So we're talking about a cell type in the pancreas. The alpha cells produce a hormone called glucagon, and the beta cells produce a hormone called insulin, which is antagonistic to it. The delta cells produce a hormone called somatostatin. We did not use that word. However, we called it growth hormone inhibiting hormone from the hypothalamus. Okay. And so that reviews for you that one hormone can be produced by multiple tissues, endocrine glands. Okay. And so growth hormone inhibiting hormone is somatostatin, is antagonistic to growth hormone release. We're going to focus on glucagon and insulin. And what does glucagon do? Y'all probably know. Brings our blood sugar up to set point. Insulin brings blood sugar down to set point. Okay, so let's just review those. Glucagon, its primary target is the liver to liberate any stored sugars out in the blood. Okay. And 2 major processes which this happens is called glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis. The end point is we're releasing what? Not glucagon. The prefixes are kind of confusing. Glycogenolysis. I'm lysing glycogen to release sugar and glucose. Okay. If I break down glycogen, I'm releasing glucose. The prefixes are confusing. And then also gluconeogenesis, like I see the prefix gluco. Okay. I'm just releasing single little molecules of glucose. Okay. Lots of them, billions of them, into the circulatory system when under the influence of glucagon. When do you think glucagon would be at its greatest level of secretion? So when would that be? In the morning. So if you stereotypically sleep through the night and you haven't eaten for a period of 5 to 8 hours, whatever, your glucagon will be secreted to maintain your blood sugar so you don't pass out in the middle of the night. Okay. Not only does it keep our blood sugars elevated, it keeps our other nutrients elevated, such as our fatty acids and proteins. Elevates proteins and amino acids. So not just sugars, but lipids or fatty acids and amino acids. Okay, can be liberated. So we don't need just sugar, right, for nutrients or energy source. And So our proteins and our fats can be broken down as well. Fats are broken down by this process called lipolysis. Lysis means breaking. Lipo is fats, okay, so we're releasing fatty acids. And proteolysis is breaking proteins to release amino acids. Okay. So we're just keeping our nutrients elevated. So, as you might imply, this is going to be humorally regulated by low levels of those things which is trying to fix. So if my blood sugar is low, my amino acid content is low, my fatty acid content levels are low, I can trigger the release of glucagon, excuse me. What questions at this point do you have about the primary role of glucagon and when it's released or what it does? It is antagonistic to a hormone called what? Insulin. Insulin and glucagon are antagonistic, and this one actually elevates our blood nutrient levels. Not elevates it. In response to elevated nutrient levels, it will bring those factors down to normal or down to set point. So it can target our liver and our fat tissue and our skeletal muscles, for example. So our liver can take glucose and make glycogen. Some cells can take amino acids and make different types of proteins and store it. Or any fatty acids can be stored in adipose tissue, for example. So it targets the rest of the body for taking excessive nutrients and storing them. Take them out of the blood and storing them. So how do you think it's regulated? Humorally regulated. In response to what? Glucose levels or fat or protein levels that are high. Okay. So probably insulin is released when? When what? When do you think insulin is going to be released? And so what would have done that? What part of your day, what parts of your day? After a meal. Okay. After a meal, you're eating food, right? You're not going to be able to use it all, especially here, right? We're not going to use all that we eat, right? And so our body has the ability to store it, because our body doesn't know when we might need it again. Okay? And so after a meal is when you see insulin being released. Okay. All right. So as described, we said high blood, or you could say humoral, elevated levels of glucose, amino acids, fatty acids, right? So after a meal, you can trigger the release of insulin. The way insulin works to getting these nutrients in, or most specifically glucose, is insulin at your fat cells triggers the release, or remember the upregulation, the term upregulation? Insulin initiates the upregulation of these things called glucose transporters. So if I add more glucose transporters to a cell, I can transport in what? Glucose, right? And so insulin actually promotes the upregulation of our glucose transporters. If we have more glucose transporters, we can take it. If it's not in the interstitial fluid, it goes into the cells and it's being stored. All right. This last image summarizes this antagonistic relationship between insulin and glucagon. We can see, for example, say after waking up in the morning, after being asleep all night, your blood sugar levels should be kind of declined. That low humoral stimulus activates the pancreas to release glucagon. Right, from which cell types? Which cell types release glucagon? The alpha cells, very good. And what it does is it targets the liver to metabolize glycogen to release glucose. blood sugar will go hopefully back to set point. Let's say I have, my body releases glucagon, my blood sugar goes up to set point, and then I run to class to the vending machine and I get a package of the zingers and some chocolate milk and some peanuts and some gummy worms, because I like to eat like that, okay? What's going to happen to my blood sugar? It's going to skyrocket, right? My protein's going to go up at the milk, so I'm healthy, right? And then, and so what's the pancreas going to do? It's going to release insulin, okay? It's going to target our body and our liver. The liver can do what with the sugar? Make glycogen. So taken out of the blood. The rest of the body cells can do what with it? If it's a fat tissue, adipose tissue, it's going to make, if I had that diet, I'm going to make fat. Even though the gummy worms are fat-free, my body's going to turn it into fat, okay? My protein, for some reason, if I went in my skeletal muscles and I used them, I would store it in the form of protein, something like that. But the whole point is that my blood sugar would go back to set point. Okay? And so those two hormones are antagonistic to maintain our blood sugar at set point range. That actually concludes our endocrine system. Why don't you take about 2 minutes to review your endocrine handouts or the hot number 4 that you guys turned in on yesterday. If you have any questions over those, I'll field those. While you're reviewing that, I'm going to pull up our chapter 12 information. We'll transition right into the skeletal muscle physiology.